There are secrets kept to protect a marriage, and there are secrets kept to protect a crown. The most dangerous ones are the kind that do both, until they stop doing either. King Charles had spent decades believing he understood the full measure of what Camilla carried. He had married her knowing the weight of their history, knowing the scrutiny that surrounded them, knowing that public acceptance had been hard-won and remained fragile in ways that official statements could not fully conceal. He had chosen her with that knowledge in full view, and he had believed, in the way that people believe things they need to be true, that there was nothing left between them that had not already been examined and accepted. The document that arrived on his desk on a quiet Tuesday morning proved that belief wrong. Inside a sealed administrative folder discovered during a routine legal review of historic royal correspondence, palace officials had uncovered a private declaration, a formal written statement carrying Camilla's personal signature and the authenticated seal of a senior royal legal advisor that had been prepared in the months before Charles and Camilla's marriage in 2005 and had never been disclosed to the king himself. Its contents described a private arrangement Camilla had made with a senior palace official regarding the terms under which she would accept the role of queen consort, terms that Charles had never been party to, never been shown, and never been asked to approve. When the document was placed before him and he understood what he was reading, those present in the private study that morning have described the king as utterly still. Not the composed stillness of a man in control, but the particular frozen quality of someone whose understanding of their own life has just been rearranged without their permission. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The document had surfaced through a process that palace archivists described, in the account that has since emerged from those close to the household, as entirely routine. A senior legal official conducting a periodic review of pre-accession correspondence, the formal term for communications and administrative records generated before Charles became king, had been cross-referencing a set of files relating to the 2005 marriage arrangements. The review was standard practice. Legal records from that period were being formally catalogued as part of a broader effort to bring the Royal Archives holdings on the transition period into alignment with current classification standards. The sealed folder had appeared in a file category marked Private Spousal Correspondence, a classification, the formal designation for personal communications between members of a married couple held within the institutional archive. That should have indicated letters or notes exchanged between Charles and Camilla privately. What the folder actually contained was not correspondence between them. It was a unilateral declaration by Camilla alone, witnessed and authenticated by a third party, and it had been filed in a category that ensured Charles would have no occasion to encounter it unless someone specifically went looking. The legal official who found it had recognized immediately that its presence in that category was irregular. She had brought it to the attention of the palace's chief legal advisor without opening it herself. The chief legal advisor had examined the external documentation, confirmed the authentication markings, and taken the folder directly to Charles. Charles had been in his private study reviewing correspondence from the morning's dispatch when the chief legal advisor entered. A private study, in palace terms, is the room where the monarch conducts personal and confidential work away from the formal business offices of the household, a space designed for the kind of reading and thinking that cannot be done under observation. Charles had looked up from the papers on his desk and read something in his advisor's expression before a single word was spoken. He had asked what it was. The advisor had explained, carefully, what the folder appeared to contain and where it had been found. Charles had listened without interrupting. When the advisor finished, Charles had held out his hand for the folder, opened it, and begun reading. He had not moved for a very long time. Camilla was not in the building. She had left earlier that morning for a scheduled public engagement, a formal visit, the kind of official appearance made on behalf of the Crown to support a charitable or civic cause, that had been arranged weeks in advance. She would not return until late afternoon. Charles finished reading the document, closed the folder, and sat with both hands flat on his desk for a moment that those present in the adjacent room, who could not hear what was happening but could measure the silence, described as lasting longer than was comfortable. Then he asked for William to be reached. To understand what Camilla's declaration contained and why Charles had not known of its existence, it was necessary to return to the months before the April 2005 wedding, a period of intense and largely private negotiation between the royal household, its legal advisers, and the various institutional bodies whose approval or acquiescence was required before the marriage could proceed without generating a constitutional crisis. Camilla had entered those negotiations from a position that was, by the account of those familiar with the dynamics of that period, considerably more complicated than the public understood. She was not simply a woman marrying a man she loved. She was a private individual becoming a senior member of the most scrutinized institution in Britain, carrying a public history that had made her the focus of sustained hostility from a significant portion of the population who associated her directly with the failure of Charles's first marriage and with Diana's suffering. The question of how she would be positioned within the royal family, what title she would hold, what role she would occupy, how her relationship to the institution would be formally defined, was not a simple administrative matter. It was a negotiation with significant political and public relations dimensions. Palace officials involved in those negotiations have since described, in the reconstruction that has emerged from multiple accounts, a series of private conversations between Camilla and a senior household official, a figure with long experience in managing the institutional dimensions of royal transitions, in which the practical terms of Camilla's entry into the family were discussed in detail that went beyond what Charles was being briefed on at the same time. This was not, those familiar with the period have noted, necessarily unusual. Royal negotiations of this kind frequently involved parallel tracks of discussion, with different parties receiving different levels of detail depending on their formal roles and the sensitivity of the information being managed. What was unusual was the document that had resulted from those conversations. Camilla had put her signature to a private declaration, prepared by the senior household official and authenticated by an independent legal witness, that set out a specific private understanding about the limits of her public role in the early years of the marriage. The declaration stated that Camilla had agreed, as a condition of the marriage proceeding under the terms the household had arranged, to refrain from exercising certain categories of informal influence over palace communications strategy and public positioning decisions for a defined initial period. It named specific areas of household management in which she had agreed not to involve herself, and it included a clause, the clause that had stopped Charles cold when he reached it, stipulating that the existence of the declaration itself was not to be disclosed to the Prince of Wales without the prior approval of the senior official who had prepared it. Charles had not been told. He had married Camilla in April 2005 with a formal declaration of her private commitments sitting in a sealed folder in a misfiled archive category, signed by his wife and witnessed by an official of his own household, and he had not known it existed. The senior household official who had prepared it had retired in 2011. He was still alive. Charles had the full archive log delivered to his study within the hour. A custody log, the formal document recording every point at which an archived item is received, moved, reviewed, or accessed, told a story that those familiar with the subsequent examination have described as both clarifying and deeply uncomfortable. The declaration had been placed in the private spousal correspondence category in June 2005, approximately 8 weeks after the wedding. The official who had filed it had used a reference number that cross-linked to Camilla's personal household file rather than to the marriage legal record, which meant it would not appear in any standard search of the pre-accession correspondence unless someone was specifically looking for personal spousal documents from that period. Charles pressed one finger against the original filing entry and held it there. The custody log showed that the document had been reviewed once since its original filing, in 2009, 4 years after the marriage, by the same senior official who had created it. His review notation read, "Retained. Terms concluded. No further action required." Terms concluded meant the defined initial period referenced in the declaration had ended. The restrictions Camilla had agreed to had expired. The official had reviewed the document, confirmed the terms were no longer active, and left it in its misfiled location without disclosing its existence to Charles or taking any step to bring it to the king's attention. The restrictions had ended. But the fact of what Camilla had agreed to, and the fact that Charles had never been told, had been quietly filed away under a reference number that ensured it would remain invisible unless something exactly like a routine legal review happened to cross its path. William arrived at the palace within the hour of being reached. He had not been told the specific content of the document, only that something significant had been discovered and that his father needed to speak with him before Camilla returned. He entered the private study to find Charles still seated at the same desk, the closed folder on the surface in front of him, his reading glasses beside it. Charles looked up when William came in. He said nothing for a moment. Then he pushed the folder across the desk and asked his son to read it. William read it in full, standing, without sitting down. When he finished, he set it back on the desk and looked at his father with the careful expression he adopted when he was deciding how much of what he was thinking to say immediately. He asked Charles one question. Had he had any indication at any point, before or after the marriage, that an arrangement of this kind had been made? Charles said he had not. He said he had been aware, in the broad general way that people are aware of things that are being managed around them, that the pre-marriage negotiations had involved a significant number of conversations he had not been central to. He had accepted that as normal. He had assumed, in the way that people assume things when they trust the people managing their affairs, that the outcome of those conversations was what he had been told it was. William said quietly that the outcome was somewhat larger than that. Charles did not answer. He picked up his reading glasses, looked at them and set them down again without putting them on. The gesture, in what those who know him have understood of his habits under pressure, carried the particular quality of a man doing something with his hands, because what he needs to do with the situation is not yet clear. William asked whether Charles intended to speak with Camilla before or after reviewing the full archive log and the details of the official who had prepared the declaration. Charles said he needed to understand the full picture first. He said it in the tone that those around him recognized as his most serious register. Not angry, not performative, but the voice he used when something had arrived that could not be addressed through the usual institutional processes and would require something more direct. What neither man yet knew was that Camilla had been aware, for some time, that the declaration existed, and that her reasons for not raising it herself were about to become the harder conversation. Camilla had returned to the palace by late afternoon. She had known, from a brief message relayed through a household aide during her public engagement, that something had occurred that required her attention when she returned. The message had not specified what. It had not needed to. In what those familiar with her manner in pressured situations have described as characteristic composure, she had completed her public engagement without any visible indication that anything unusual was developing. She had spoken to the people she was there to speak to. She had performed the role she was there to perform. And she had returned to the palace carrying the knowledge that a conversation she had been aware might someday arrive had now arrived. She went directly to Charles's private study. William had been asked to wait in an adjacent room. The meeting between Charles and Camilla that followed has been described, by those who have come to understand its substance through subsequent accounts from people close to both of them, as one of the most significant private conversations of their marriage. There was no shouting. There was no dramatics of the kind that palace corridors sometimes carry even through closed doors. There was the particular quality of two people who have known each other for most of their adult lives, confronting something that cannot be managed with the usual tools of a long relationship: warmth, familiarity, the accumulated credit of decades. Charles showed her the document. She looked at it without the expression of someone encountering something unexpected. He asked her whether she had known it existed. She said that she had known. He asked her why she had not told him. What followed, in the account that has since taken shape from those close to the household, was Camilla's explanation. Not a defense exactly, but an account of the position she had been in during those pre-marriage negotiations, in a way that Charles, she said, had not been positioned to fully see from the inside of the process. She told him that the arrangement had not been her idea. The senior household official had presented it as a practical necessity, a formal private assurance that would satisfy certain institutional concerns about her influence in the early years without requiring those concerns to be raised publicly or put to Charles in a form that might complicate the marriage proceedings at a delicate moment. She had understood it as a form of institutional management of a situation that was, whatever either of them might have preferred, genuinely complicated. She had agreed to sign it because she had believed at the time that the restrictions it described were reasonable, that the confidentiality clause was an ordinary feature of institutional negotiations of that kind, and that the document would become irrelevant once the defined period had elapsed. She had not raised it afterward because it had become irrelevant, and because raising it would have required explaining why she had not raised it sooner, which had felt, by the time the terms expired, like a conversation that would cause more damage than the document itself. Charles listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The damage it has caused is that I have spent 20 years married to you without knowing that a formal declaration about your role was made the week before our wedding, that you agreed to it without telling me, and that an official of my own household decided I was not to be informed." Camilla said, "I know." He said, "I need to understand which part of this you believe was acceptable." She said, after a pause, "None of it, in retrospect. At the time, I believed the intention was to protect both of us." Charles sat with that for a long moment. Then he asked the question that those who have since learned the substance of this conversation have described as the one that cut deepest. Had she ever, in 20 years, considered telling him? Camilla said, "Yes, many times." Charles said, "And?" Camilla said, "And each time I decided the timing was wrong, and then time passed, and the moment that would have felt right never quite came." The room was quiet for a long time after that. William had been waiting in the adjacent room for nearly 2 hours when Charles came out. He looked at his father's face and understood immediately that the conversation had not produced a resolution, not because it had gone badly, exactly, but because some conversations do not produce resolutions. They produce clarity about the shape of a problem, which is a different thing. Charles told William, briefly, what Camilla had said. William listened without asking many questions. He had learned, over many years, that his father processed difficult things most usefully when given the space to report, rather than to be interrogated. When Charles finished, William asked what he needed. Charles said he needed to understand the full history of the official who had created the document, and to establish formally, through the independent review he intended to order, whether this had been an isolated arrangement or whether there were other undisclosed documents of similar character in the pre-accession correspondence archive. William said that was the right starting point. He said it carefully, in a way that left room for the other conversation, the one about what this meant for Charles and Camilla personally, without forcing it into a space neither of them was ready for. Charles said, "She should have told me." William said, "Yes." Charles said, "I understand why she didn't. I understand the position she was in. I understand that the official placed her in a situation that made disclosure feel impossible, and then progressively more difficult. I understand all of that." William waited. Charles said, "It doesn't change the fact that for 20 years I have not known something I should have known about my own marriage." William said nothing. He moved slightly closer to his father and stayed there, in the particular way he had of indicating presence without making it a performance. Charles said, quietly, 20 years is a long time to carry something alone." William, who understood that his father might not only be speaking about Camilla, said, "Yes, it is." By the following morning, the discovery had escaped the private rooms where it had been discussed. In what those monitoring communications around the household have described as a rapid and unexpected movement of information, the broad outline of the story, a hidden document, Camilla's signature, a clause keeping Charles uninformed, had reached several media organizations before any official palace response had been prepared. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered at the gates before noon. It was not the organized kind. A man stood near the front holding a printed copy of a photograph of Charles and Camilla at their 2005 wedding, a picture taken in the moment after the ceremony when they had turned to face the assembled guests for the first time as a married couple. He held it quietly, not raising it above his head, not speaking to the cameras that found him. The image made 3 front pages before the palace statement was released. A national broadcaster described the discovery that evening not as a marriage crisis but as something the public found more troubling, evidence that the palace's culture of managing information on behalf of senior royals had extended, in this case, to managing information from the king himself. The question left in the air was not whether the marriage would survive. The question was whether Charles had ever fully been permitted to be the author of his own decisions, or whether the institution had made that impossible in ways neither he nor anyone around him had been positioned to see clearly. He didn't know. She didn't tell him. The headline ran above a photograph of Charles at his coronation, the crown on his head, looking forward with the expression of a man who has accepted an enormous weight and intends to carry it. 2 commentators outside the palace gates disagreed, on camera, about whether Camilla had acted wrongly by not disclosing the document or had been placed in an impossible position by an official who should never have created it. Their disagreement was not resolvable, and they both knew it, but they continued because the question underneath their argument, whether trust inside a marriage could survive having been built, even partly, on an institutional omission, was a question that neither the palace nor anyone else could answer for the people to whom it most mattered. Charles released a formal statement through the palace press office by early afternoon. It confirmed that a historic administrative document relating to the pre-marriage period had been discovered during a routine legal review. It confirmed that an independent examination of all pre-accession correspondence from that period had been ordered. It stated that the household had identified the retired official responsible for the document's creation and was seeking his account as part of that examination. It said, in language that those familiar with palace communications recognized as unusually personal for a formal release, that the matter was first and most significantly a private family matter, and that the king and queen consort were addressing it privately with the seriousness it deserved. The statement confirmed one institutional reform. All future pre-marriage legal documentation involving senior members of the royal family would require the explicit reviewed acknowledgement of both parties before being filed in the institutional archive. No arrangement made on behalf of a royal principal could be classified in a way that prevented its disclosure to their spouse. The reform was specific. Its meaning was direct. What had happened to Charles's marriage could not, under the new rule, happen again. Charles returned to his private study that evening after a day that those close to him have described as one of the most difficult of his reign. Not because of the public pressure, which had been significant, and not because of the institutional questions, which were serious, but because of the particular exhaustion of spending a day examining the foundations of something you had believed you understood, and discovering that the foundations were more complicated than you had been allowed to know. Camilla came to find him. She did not send an aide ahead. She came herself, and she stood in the doorway of the private study for a moment before he looked up, and when he saw her, his expression did not immediately resolve into anything simple. She sat across from him, not beside him, not at the desk with him, but across from him, the deliberate geometry of two people who need to see each other clearly. She said, "I owe you a fuller account than I gave you yesterday, not of what happened in 2005. Of every moment since when I chose not to tell you." Charles said, "I'm listening." What followed, in the account of those who have come to understand the substance of that evening, was not a scene of dramatic revelation or tearful confession. It was something quieter and more difficult, Camilla describing, year by year, the accumulation of moments when the conversation had felt possible, and then, for reasons she described with the kind of honesty that has no interest in self-protection, had not been started. The early years when the marriage was still finding its footing and raising the document felt like introducing a structural problem into something fragile. The middle years when it had become clear the terms had expired and the document was technically irrelevant, and she had convinced herself that irrelevance was sufficient reason for continued silence. The later years when telling him would have required explaining so many layers of why she had not told him sooner that the explanation itself had seemed more damaging than the original omission. Charles listened to all of it. He asked occasional questions, not challenging ones but clarifying ones, the questions of someone trying to build an accurate picture rather than to assign blame. When she finished, he said, "I believe everything you have told me tonight." She said, "I know you do." "That has always been the part that made this most difficult to carry." He said, "You could have trusted me with it." She said, "I know. I was afraid that knowing I hadn't told you from the beginning would matter more to you than the content of what I hadn't told you." Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It does matter. It will continue to matter for some time." Camilla said, "I know that too." He said, "But it is not the only thing that matters. And I have not spent 20 years building something with you to allow a document I was not permitted to know about to define what that something is." Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The private study was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when the most significant thing that needed to be said has finally been said, and both people in the room are adjusting to the new weight of it. Charles eventually said, "The official who created that document made a decision that was not his to make. He decided that the king did not need to know the full terms under which his wife had agreed to marry him. Whatever his reasons, that decision was a profound overreach, and I intend the review to establish that clearly." Camilla said, "Yes." He said, "You and I have a different conversation to continue, a longer one that I think will take more than this evening." Camilla said, "I know. I'm not going anywhere." Charles looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "No, you're not, and neither am I. But I need you to understand that from this point there is nothing that you believe I cannot be trusted with. Do you understand that?" She said, "Yes, I understand that." He said, "Then we begin there." What the document had exposed was not the failure of a marriage. It had exposed the particular way that an institution, in the act of protecting its own stability, could make genuine intimacy between the people inside it structurally more difficult than it needed to be. The senior official who had created the declaration had believed he was managing a complicated situation with appropriate care. He had not believed he was damaging the foundations of the relationship he was trying to protect. But the effect of his decision, 20 years of a king married to a queen who carried a private declaration about her own role that her husband had never been permitted to see, was a form of institutional interference in a private life that no title, no administrative category, and no archival misfiling could adequately excuse. Charles understood that the review he had ordered would find what it was going to find: a retired official who had made a decision that exceeded his authority, inside a palace culture that had historically rewarded the management of information over its transparent disclosure, in a period when the pressures surrounding the 2005 marriage had made careful management feel like the most responsible available option. The review would not find malice. It would find the particular kind of institutional harm that arrives wrapped in good intentions and files itself under a mislabeled category where it waits, perfectly preserved, for a routine audit to find it 20 years later. He had spoken with Camilla. He had spoken with William. He had ordered the independent examination. He had released a statement. He had announced a reform. What remained was the private work, the longer conversation Camilla had said she understood was necessary, the gradual process of adjusting to a truth about the history of their marriage that neither of them could unknow, the rebuilding of a particular kind of trust that did not require starting from nothing, but did require being honest about where it had been weakened and how. Charles had not become king expecting that the throne would make his private life simpler. He had understood from the beginning that the institution would press its requirements into every available space, and that the work of remaining fully himself inside that pressure was never finished. What he had not fully accounted for was the specific way that the institution's pressure could work on the people closest to him in the same moment it was working on him, creating parallel difficulties that neither of them could see clearly from where they stood, and that could accumulate in silence for 20 years before the archive surfaced the evidence. He had not been shown the document at the time. He had not been permitted to know. That was a wrong that the review would document and the reform would address. What he chose to do now, with Camilla, with William, with the private weight of 20 years of a marriage that had been built in good faith on foundations he had not been shown the full picture of, that part was not the institution's to manage. That part was his. The crown had demanded many things from Charles over the course of a long life. It had demanded composure in moments that deserved grief, restraint in moments that deserved fury, and institutional language in moments that required something entirely human. He had given it all of those things, and he had paid their costs in ways that those around him sometimes understood and sometimes did not. What it had not taken from him, what it had not been able to take, despite everything, was his capacity to return, when the institution's demands retreated, to the person underneath them. The person who had loved Camilla before any of this began. The person who had chosen her, with full knowledge of the cost. The person who was still, under everything the crown required him to perform, entirely capable of sitting across from his wife in a quiet room, and choosing to begin again from where they actually were, rather than from where it would have been more convenient to be. He had not been told the full truth of his own marriage at the moment he entered it. That was a wrong done to him, and it would be examined and documented and insured against repetition. He had been told the full truth now, by the woman who had carried it alone for 20 years, in a private study, with no advisors in the room, and no institutional language available to soften the shape of it. Charles had listened, he had understood, and he had chosen to remain. Not because the institution required it, not because the crown would benefit from it, but because 20 years of a marriage, complicated, scrutinized, historically imperfect, and genuinely his, was not something a misfiled document in a mislabeled archive category had the power to erase. What Camilla's final secret had revealed was not the worst thing he had imagined when the folder was placed on his desk. It had revealed something more difficult and more human, that the people we love are sometimes carrying things alone that we could have helped them carry, and that the moment of being told is always both too late and exactly on time. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.